Good evening to all. On behalf of LTSI, we are welcoming all the eminent professors, both international as well as the national level, and all the faculty members and the delegates. To start our program, so today the first session is the case-based discussion, the approach to acute liver failure. To chair the session, I am inviting Dr. Ravi Mohan Gao, Chief Surgeon and Head of the Department of Liver Transplant Surgery at Global Hospital, Mumbai. He has published more than 35 articles in high impact journal. And co-chair, Dr. Shalimar, who is the Associate Professor in AIIMS, and his main area of interest in the acute liver failure, acute on chronic liver failure, and NASH and HCC. Over to chairpersons to start the session on the approach to acute liver failure.
Thank you, Dr. Joy. So we have a very eminent moderator, Dr. Manav Vadhavan. He is the head of hepatology and transplant hepatology at BL Kapoor Hospital, New Delhi, and one of the most well-known hepatologists and transplant hepatologists in the country. Request Dr. Manav to start his presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Ravi. Thanks for the kind invitation. So this is a panel discussion where we have Ravi and Shalimar as chairpersons, and we have 4 panelists also along with us. So I've tried to keep it very simple. So the 4 panelists here would be Sharath, Dr. Sharath Putta, Dr. Zubair, Dr. Pathik, and Dr. Srinivas Reddy. I'm not sure whether Srinivas has joined or not, but the format of this presentation is basically to understand what each of us do with acute liver failure patient and how we should approach a case. How do we decide for transplant, which criteria we use, and how do we manage these patients in the ICU? So this is a broad objective, and I'm going to invite each of you, one of you, to give comments on this. Now, a very contentious issue is definition of acute liver failure. I will refer you to this systematic review, which talked about 40 definitions for acute liver failure. And one endeavor of our hepatology community here in India is to develop one definition which all of us should follow. So let me ask each one of you, which definition of acute liver do we follow? Before we do that, I'll just give you a brief of the original classical definition, which was proposed by Trey and Davidson in 1970. So they defined acute liver failure as jaundice, encephalopathy, and coagulopathy within 8 weeks of the first symptom of jaundice. So encephalopathy within 8 weeks with or without ascites, and obviously patient should not have cirrhosis. This was originally proposed, and it has been modified multiple times over. 40 people, 40 different definitions. The ASLD definition talks about up to 26 weeks. So the ASLD definition talks about 26 weeks. The Trey-Davidson definition talks about 8 weeks. We recently had a consensus in NASAL. I'll talk about that. But before I go to the consensus where all experts sat down and discussed what should be our definition, let me first ask Srinivas only. Srinivas, which definition do you follow to define acute liver failure?
I think normally 8 weeks is what we, previously completed well, and then acute deterioration of last week.
Okay. Thanks. Sharath, what is your comment on that? Dr. Sharath, can you hear me?
Anything up to 8 weeks will obviously.
Anything up to 8 weeks.
ALF.
Okay. Shalimar, what do we follow at All India Institute of Medical Sciences?
So actually, this was the initial work of Professor Acharya, which he spent all his life working on acute liver failure. What he collated the data of all consecutive patients of acute liver failure coming to our hospital. And what he very clearly reported is that almost like 90 to 95% of our patients of acute liver failure will present within 4 weeks. So we've been using a definition of clinical presentation like syndrome, what you mentioned of jaundice, coagulopathy, encephalopathy. These are the 3 cardinal manifestations of a patient with acute liver failure. It's the time duration which varies across the globe, and the etiologies vary. We see most of the patients presenting within 4 weeks, in contrast to the ASLD, which may report it as up to 26 weeks. The UK guys will report it to 8 weeks, and others will report it very little differently. So our definition would include up to 4 weeks.
Thanks, Shalimar, for that. And that's exactly what all of us who were gathered for that INASL ALF consensus meeting decided. That definition in our part of the world, in India, should be less than 4 weeks, with a caveat that drug-induced liver injury may present between 5 to 8 weeks, between 4 to 8 weeks. So that's a caveat, but 95%, as Shalimar said, would present within 4 weeks. So in our context, the definition of ALF should be usually 4 weeks, but in case of drug-induced liver injury, up to 8 weeks. We tend to classify the other presentations, later presentation, as subacute hepatic failure, and they do have prognostic as well as therapeutic implications. So a guy who's presenting 12 weeks after the onset of jaundice probably has a subacute hepatic failure and more likely to need a transplant. On the other hand, acute liver failure, a hyperacute liver failure presenting within 7 days has a better chance of survival with medical management as compared to a transplant. So that's what the data across India has been shown. So for residents, the definition of ALF is 4 weeks predominantly and up to 8 weeks if you're talking about drug-induced liver injury. So let's go to the second question which we thought we'll talk about. How do I evaluate acute liver failure? Now, this is a chart which shows how our ALF is different as compared to West. 80% of our acute liver failures are due to hepatotropic viruses. Around 5% is ATT. Acetaminophen, which forms a predominant mode of ALF, cause of ALF in the West, is hardly less than 1%. If you ask me, in my last 20 years of experience, I have only seen 2 acetamin-associated acute liver failures. So there's a demographic difference. I don't know whether people don't take acetaminophen here or they have better things to cause injury to themselves. So the suicidal intent of acetaminophen causing ALF is not seen in India. Proper history, obviously that goes without saying, but 2 important things which I thought I would highlight here is that we have to be very careful about mimics. So we often jump the gun to diagnose acute liver failure in somebody who has an encephalopathy with fever, with jaundice. There are so many conditions which we see in our part of country. Malaria, dengue, especially in dengue season, all of us would remember that we see guys who come with an enzyme pattern of 1000, 1500 SGOT, SGPT, bilirubins of 10. They have altered sensorium. We classify them as acute liver failure, but when you look at their INRs, they are much lower. Maybe they are 1.3, 1.2. Can I ask Pathik to comment here? Do you come across the mimics of acute liver failure in your clinical practice, and how do you try to differentiate them?
So whenever any patient, yeah, I'm unmuted now. So whenever any patient presents to us with acute liver failure, we usually look for A, E, B at the onset. And if they turn out to be negative, then we also start looking for other etiologies as well as leptospira. We commonly look for leptospira. Other than that, dengue and chikungunya also we send for antibodies. So the primary hepatotropic virus are the first ones to look for.
So whenever we see, there are 3 things which I would personally look at in the clinical presentation and the initial investigation which I have to suspect mimics. Obviously, drug history is important, but if I see low platelet counts at the onset of the disease, the patient has come to you within 5 days and you see a very low platelet count, think of something else. AKI at presentation is unusual. And the most important thing is INR. So most of these mimics, whether leptospirosis or malaria or a dengue, the INR will either be normal or mildly prolonged. And that's when I actually start looking at probably this guy may be having another cause. If you look at the workup, the standard workup, as you very rightly said, is primary 80%, 90% of our ALFs are hepatotropic viruses. So we look at all of them. If these are negative, then we may look at HSV RNA also, and obviously want to do a toxicology screen. A prior history of ATT is important. We always ask for that. So that's where we do the etiological workup. Let's go to jump straight to the case. This was a 25-year-old male patient presented in altered sensorium, preceded by a short onset fever and jaundice. The interval between jaundice and encephalopathy was 6 days. At presentation in the emergency, his heart rate was 120 per minute. He had icterus and he had bilaterally equal pupils reacting equally to light. Liver was short in span, 2 spaces only, without any splenomegaly. The patient was in grade 2 encephalopathy at the time of presentation. Look at his bilirubin 15, INR of 3.4, AST, ALT 3500, TLC and platelet counts are normal. IgM HEV was positive. The patient came with a report from outside. The guy who had referred the patient to us had already got the viral markers done. B and C were negative, A was negative, and HEV was positive. 120 heart rate, mean arterial pressure of 65, and arterial ammonia of 145 micromole per liter. Now, let's try and see here, how do we decide which patient to ask for transplant and which criteria we follow here before we go on to the ICU management. So can I ask Zubair, at your center, what are the criteria you follow to decide that this patient possibly would need a transplant or should be worked up for a transplant? Dr. Zubair? Okay, can I pass the question to Ravi?
Sure. So basically, every patient who comes in with meeting the criteria of ALF, we will talk to them about transplant and we will prepare also for transplant. If they meet the criteria for listing, we will also list them. Having said that, for A and E, we have an extremely high threshold for actually doing the transplant. So we will keep them on the list. We will get a living donor ready and get permission and everything. But for this guy, we would at least wait for 2 days before we will and see the trend before we will finally decide.
Great. And which criteria would you like to follow?
Above 150. So unfortunately, we currently follow King's in Mumbai for listing. But for a living donor transplant, we would not follow King's because A and E really you can't use King's because there were no patients in that group. So we will go by the trend of ammonia, lactate, and the cerebral edema to make a decision. And we also do an AFP.
What would?
Sorry, we also do an AFP, and we'll do the AFP on day 1 and day 3. That sometimes gives us a lot of information.
So there are 2 very important points, Ravi, you have made. One is all ALF patients should be at least listed for transplant. That is point number 1 which you're trying to make. And secondly, you should not rely on KCC alone to decide for transplant. I'll talk about each one of these subsequently. Let me ask Dr. Srinivas, what is their comment? Which criteria do they follow for transplant at their center?
I think I partly agree with Ravi. All patients who come with acute liver failure are usually transferred. They're all encephalopathic. So they would they'll at least have an initial discussion about transplantation and exploring the possibility of a living donor. I think the listing criteria in Tamil Nadu are a bit more stricter, so the patient has to be fit King's College criteria to be listed for transplantation. But again, like he said, the trend is most important in planning for a living donor transplantation. The patient looks like he's getting better, even if he fits King's College criteria. You have a donor in hand, we wait and see how he's progressing. I think in Tamil Nadu, the most common cause is actually rat killer poisoning, which doesn't follow any criteria. So, you can.
That doesn't fit into any criteria actually.
Patient can deteriorate, crash within 24 hours. So we have a donor ready if possible, and we list the patient. And we've been trying to change the criteria for at least for rat killer poisoning in Tamil Nadu. So listing criteria. But I think encephalopathy has to be there before they can list it. But it's always important to have a donor, if possible, ready in case they deteriorate.
Great. So, both of you are conforming to the same fact that KCC may not be very good in deciding transplant for our set of patients, whether it's rat killer poisoning or it is hepatitis A or hepatitis E. And I'm sure Dr. Pathik and Dr. Shalimar also will agree to what you guys are saying. So the biggest problem with King's College criteria, it doesn't fit into our set of etiologies. Secondly, it has a very low negative predictive value. So simple for a resident to understand is, we are talking about 5 criteria here in non-acetaminophen group: INR, age, bilirubin, jaundice, encephalopathy, and non-B, which also includes non-E here actually. So if you look at 100 patients and you have 3 or more criteria the patient is positive for, then 85% of these patients are going to die without a transplant. So you can predict who's going to die. But look at this, even in less than 3 criteria, 35% of patients are still going to die. So you still lose 35% patients who are not fitting into King's College criteria here. So it has a very low negative predictive value. That is why it is not very important. And this is actually what we follow. And may I invite Shalimar, who was a part of the original, he has been the part of the group who has published this criteria, the dynamic model, which most of us follow. So Ravi, you may not be following LFED, but you did talk about the dynamic nature of the criteria you follow. You want to watch over 48 hours and look at their lactates and look at the other things. Similarly, Dr. Srinivas also said the same thing. He wants to see whether what's happening to the INR and other criteria. Dr. Shalimar, can I invite you to talk about LFED rather than me talking about it?
If we just take this patient, what you had discussed, so this patient had a bill of 15. I had jotted down your values, INR of 3.4 and jaundice to encephalopathy duration of 6 days. So he doesn't fit into the KCC criteria, and it has its own limitations, as you highlighted. It has a poor predictive value in the outcome. So that prompted us to look at our patient cohort and see which of these patients were improving and which were not improving. So that was the reason why this ALFED model was developed, in which we looked at retrospectively a cohort of almost like 400 patients, looked at their dynamic values, and from the regression analysis, we found 4 variables. That is the INR, the bilirubin, hepatic encephalopathy, and ammonia. So these 4 parameters, depending upon how dynamic they are over the next 48 hours, helps you in predicting the outcome. So higher the score, so any score above 5 and 6 would predict a very poor outcome in such patients. So that can help you in triaging patients over the next, see, if this patient from grade 2 goes on to grade 3 or grade 4, his bill increases, or his INR worsens, or his arterial ammonia, which already is very high, worsens or doesn't come down, we're looking at a bad outcome. So by looking at these simple clinical and lab parameters, you can prognosticate your patient. So this is what was how this ALFED score was made, though this has only been derived at our center, but definitely needs a validation at the transplant center, whether it really works well and helps you in predicting the outcome of your patient and helps you in deciding the management, whether if a person has a bad or say a high ALFED score, will doing a transplant improve his outcome? And if his ALFED score is dropping, you just don't do a transplant. So this thing needs to be validated at transplant centers.
So thanks, Shalimar. So most of us would agree that the dynamic nature of the presentation is important, and that is captured. In fact, after the dynamic model was published, even in UK, the King's College guys have started doing a daily King's College KCC to apply for their patients. That's what I've heard. I think they're coming with a new dynamic score. So the concept of dynamicity has to be incorporated in the transplant decision. And that's very well captured by LFED or any other criteria which you follow, whether you look at alpha-fetoprotein or progressive INR. What I want to highlight is the basic presentation. The first presentation of an INR of 6.5, more than 6.5, also does not apply in our case. So we have seen patients who come with the first INR of 7, and after 48 hours of medical management, they start improving. So in a hepatitis A, E, a basic INR of more than 6.5 also does not apply. So we have to look at dynamic criteria, and that's what we would do. Similar to Ravi and Srinivas's thing, so I'll take away the word here listed, counseled, I should say counseled, because listing is a different concept. So all patients who come with acute liver failure are counseled for transplant. We monitor their progress over the next 24 to 48 hours and take a call. In the meantime, those 48 hours are not lost. You work up a donor. What would happen at the end of 48 hours is the patient starts improving and you cancel the transplant. That's always easy to do. But if you decide after 48 hours that this patient needs a transplant, and then you take 24 more hours to work up the donor, that is where you may land up in trouble. So we would counsel all patients for transplant, try to work up their donors if they agree. And if you have to shift a patient from a peripheral center to a transplant center, it should be done early. If you're doing that in grade 4 encephalopathy, you're causing more trouble. That's again something I wanted to highlight for everybody listening, all the residents listening here. ALS patient should be managed in a ICU which is state of art for acute liver failure management. And if the patient agrees for a transplant in case needed, then he should be shifted to a transplant center as soon as possible. Dr. Sharad, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, Manav, I think if there's one important takeaway for some of the participants who may not be working in transplant centers is to identify these patients early and move them to centers that can manage liver failure. I'll just also mention some work that I did during my training, which we presented at EASL, about which group of patients the pre-ALF, if you can call it that, or severe ALI, severe acute liver injury. We looked at 5 parameters before the onset of encephalopathy. So if you have a patient who is I'm talking about even one stage earlier than this, just before encephalopathy, we looked at 5 parameters: leukocytosis, pulse rate, age, serum bilirubin, and creatinine. And it works a little bit like MELD. And if you score high on these 5 parameters, that's when district hospitals had to move their patients to university hospitals. So yeah, it's quite important that these patients get into hepatology centers before they have encephalopathy. I think that's when they have ALI, you can call it severe ALI, where their INR is more than 1.5 and the bili is starting to go up, they're a bit tachycardic and have leukocytosis.
Okay, great, thank you. I have to ask the chairpersons here. I think we have 20 more minutes with us. We started at 5:05, we are 5:25. So should we go on and discuss the ICU management, or should we jump on to autoimmune hepatitis as a cause of ALF? Or maybe we can just briefly discuss both, whatever the chairperson.
Manav, can you just touch on one very important aspect of autoimmune hepatitis very briefly on using steroids with with incipient ALF or early ALF?
So should we first talk about autoimmune hepatitis and then come to ICU management?
Yeah.
Manav, you have time. You have to take your time, man.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then I'll follow the pattern. The pattern here is, how do I manage this patient of acute liver failure? So this is point number 1. Please identify cause. It is very important. See, hepatitis A, hepatitis E, viral hepatotopic viruses, the management would differ depending on what. If you have hepatitis B as a cause of ALF, there are some papers which say that early starting antiviral may help these patients in a longer run. Although I personally doubt that, but there is some data supporting that. But more importantly, in autoimmune hepatitis, in Wilson's, in drug-induced hepatitis, it makes a whole lot of a difference in identifying the cause. We'll talk about steroids subsequently. I have a few slides on that, and we'll try to discuss what is our practice also in autoimmune hepatitis. But you have to stop the offending drug if you have a drug-induced hepatitis. So please, you should not stop at saying that 80% of our hepatitis are hepatotropic viruses. You have to identify the rest 20% also, because it has an implication on the management. How many of us use NS-cysteine in ALF? Dr. Zubair, last time we could not connect to him. Can I ask him, what is his clinical practice? Does he use NS-cysteine in all patients or infected patients? Dr. Zubair?
Hello, hi. Yeah, sorry about that. I had a bit of a connection issue earlier. Now, our routine practice, a lot of times when we get acute liver failure patients admitted to our ICU, we do not know the etiology. So as a protocol, yes, we do start them on NS-cysteine. Having said that, we use that for our some of our hepatectomies as well. That is a practice as of now. However, we all know that the good evidence for that is in paracetamol poisoning, and we hardly ever find paracetamol-induced acute liver failure in our setting. Even if we do start NS-cysteine, we continue it only for about 3 to 4 days at best. So that is the sort of protocol that we use at our hospital.
Great. So we have papers which say that it may be useful in non-acetaminophen causes also, and I think across India, I would say across the world, NS-cysteine is one drug which most of us use. Although how much benefit it does, we have doubt, but it's a safe drug to use, so we do use that. So identifying cause, I've talked about that. Okay, I forgot to talk about this, acute Budd-Chiari syndrome. If you identify Budd-Chiari syndrome as a cause of acute liver failure, there is evidence. There is good evidence to suggest that just diverting the blood flow making the blood bypass the liver may help these patients. The simple tips may improve these ALF patients, although the percentage of success is less. So in addition to autoimmune in hepatitis B, you have to look at acute Budd-Chiari as a cause of acute liver failure because they have specific non-transplant treatment options. Okay, so this is one slide. I put all of them together. I'm not going to discuss. I'm only going to ask our the panel, which one of these do we use in our patients, or do we use any one of them as a measure of decreasing cerebral edema? Lactulose, gut contamination, LOLA, hyperventilation, or hypothermia? May I start with Dr. Sharath?
Yeah, Manav, there is a real world and there is published literature. I think there's a lot of use of lactulose in ALF, and I find it more problematic than helpful, particularly in ICU patients who are not up and about, who already have a bit of abdominal distension, and which makes matters worse, particularly if your patient is being ventilated. So I definitely don't use lactulose for my ALFs. Gut T-con, I don't particularly use that. L-ornithine, L-aspartate, again, it's not something that I frequently use. I think what I would do for my cerebral edema patients is maintain their sodium around 140 to 145, and
we'll come to that. It's a specific question. I've asked you about 5 things, Sharath.
Sorry, I don't particularly hyperventilate, but I aim for a PCO2 of between 30 to 35. I don't hyperventilate.
Okay. One more panelist to comment on this. Dr. Srinivas, any one of these 5 you use in your patients?
I think we use lactulose enemas. We don't give them through NG because that will cause bloating. Lactulose enemas is something that prescribed. And I think LOLA is also used.
Okay. Dr. Pathik, any comments?
We do not use lactulose or LOLA. We usually, if the patient is intubated, we try to maintain, as he said, CO2 between 30 to 40 and normothermia. So if the patient is having pyrexia, we try and cool them down. But no, we do not go for hypothermia or any of this, particularly for all of our patients.
Absolutely. So actually, I can ask Shalimar to educate us why not to use LOLA, because the paper has come from his center. But I think that will take more time. I'll ask something more important to Shalimar. So lactulose should not be used. Enemas can be used. It's okay. Gut decontamination is not required. You're using IV antibiotics anyway, and you cannot even contaminate the gut. LOLA has not been shown to be of any use in these patients. It does not decrease ammonia in acute liver failure. The reason is more conceptual. We'll discuss in some other setting. Hyperventilation, you can use spurts of hyperventilation to decrease cerebral edema during attacks, but again, it is not very useful. Hypothermia at which you decrease cerebral edema, that level of hypothermia you cannot achieve. So I would say these 5 practically are no. What actually works is these things. You have to maintain cardiovascular stability. You have to decrease lactic acidosis. In a patient with AKI, you need to decrease the uremic load if you have to initiate early dialysis. Hypernatremia, hyponatremia, both need to be corrected. Now, Sharath wanted to talk about this, so I'll ask him to talk about this. What would he do? Now, this is our patient which we did. Serum ammonia is 131, INR is 4.1, and creatinine is 1.1. Can you tell us what would you do with this sodium? How would you try to manage it? Dr. Sharath.
Yeah, Manav, what did you say his grade of encephalopathy was?
So he has worsened from grade 2 to grade 3 now. This is 24 hours or 6 hours later.
Okay, so see, I think we need to increase the sodium, but we can't be gung-ho and can't shift it too rapidly also. I would want the sodium to be around 140 to 145. The 150s, I think there were days when, people were really pushing the envelope and taking it to 150, 155s. I would not take it to that level, but 140 to 145, but I would also be very cautious about taking it there over at least a 24-hour period.
So that's a very important point you're making, Sharath. So two things to understand here. The recommended is 145 to 150, but this patient also has cerebral edema. Once you iatrogenically raise it to 150, sometimes it becomes impossible to stop it there. It may rise to 155 years in patients where we correct it to 150, and then you can't stop it. It keeps on rising because of the impact the cerebral edema has on these patients. Because the whole sodium homeostasis goes for the toss. So 140 to 145 is what you want to target. It may go up to 150 even without intervention once you target 145. And again, the timing, very rightly pointed out. I want all the residents to understand that the standard correction should be less than 12 millimoles in 24 hours and 16 millimoles otherwise. But this is important. This helps much more than the lactuloses and decontaminations or L-ornithine L-aspartate. A serum creatinine, which was 0.7 to start with, has risen to 1.1. So, Dr. Zubair, would you like to do anything for the creatinine? Would you classify that as a AKI, or would you just let it pass and just try to hydrate? Or
oh yeah, first of all, the discussion of that starts with how much of whether there's a prerenal component to this patient. So we'll have to see what sort of hydration they have received. How much of we have to assess the volume status of the patient. That can be assessed in multiple ways. Usually we tend to use echocardiography, transthoracic echo, and we look at the IVC collapsibility, look at the RV, etc. So definitely, as we all know, there's a significant element of pre-renal component in this patient, and they've got relative hypovolemia due to low systemic vascular resistance. So we need to make sure that we've rolled out that component. So definitely we need to hydrate them appropriately. Yes, that 0.3 milligram per deciliter rise is definitely significant, but we need to make sure we've corrected the correctable causes. So that is how we start off in this situation. And
great, that covers everything. So we should not be relying on CVP for monitoring these patients, the volume status. Look at IVC size, look at IVC diameter variability, or you look at the other parameters which we have. Okay, before I go further, I forgot to talk about one specific thing. When you want to raise sodium, so there is a practice where people actually start giving an infusion of 3% normal saline. Now, I wanted to highlight again for the residents' purpose here that if you are using normal saline, 3% normal saline or whatever to raise sodium, it has to be used in boluses and not as a continuous infusion. That's something very important. And same thing applies to mannitol also. Mannitol has been shown to decrease cerebral edema, but there are two things, or actually three things, which you want to make sure before you give mannitol. One, the patient should have normal renal function. Second, the osmolarity has to be less than 320 milliosmol per liter, and each time you give mannitol, the osmolarity has to be within range. If you give mannitol in a patient who has high serum osmolarity, you may actually be harming the patient by increasing it further and increasing cerebral edema. And thirdly, just like sodium chloride, it has to be used as boluses and not as a continuous infusion, and not as an 8-hourly dose. You cannot write a prescription of 8-hourly mannitol in any patient of acute liver failure. Okay, at 24 hours. So this guy is worsening. Bilirubin started with 15, goes to 21, INR 4.8, lapses into grade 4 encephalopathy. Shalimar, what do you think Alfred tells us now?
So that tells us like he is worsening. We have ammonia. I think that would be the fourth parameter I was looking for. If that is also showing a rise, then I think it's pretty early trends suggesting patient is worsening. We need to prime him up for a change of our strategy in management. Transplant definitely needs to be counseled. Like patient needs to be counseled. He's worsening.
Absolutely. So this guy is worsening as per our criteria. The dynamicity, it is worsening. The ammonia actually did not increase in this guy, but the other three parameters did worsen. Okay, the INR of 4.8, Dr. Pathik, this guy, would you like to transfuse him FFP? If yes, when?
Not unless he's bleeding, or not unless we require an outline. Then we put it. Then we correct based on other fibrinogen and FFP, cryo or FFP. We will give it only if we require it for line insertion of active bleeding. not as a routine.
Okay, Dr. Ravi, can you highlight the problems we face if we decide to transfuse FFP in these patients?
So, first of all, we would not transfuse except for bleeding. So we'll always do a TEG, and if the TEG is all right, then all lines can be put even without any corrections. But the main problem is that once you have corrected, then you have lost one of the most important parameters for monitoring this patient. And then, you don't know over the next 12 hours or 48 hours or 24 hours whether this patient has worsened or it has improved because you've lost INR as your parameter.
And moreover, if the patient has any degree of renal failure, then you're inducing more iron overload, you're increasing the osmolarity, you're actually increasing the severe edema in this patient. So we would also transfuse only in case the patient has bleeding. Even for central lines, arterial lines, there's a plus minus. You can still make a point that for arterial lines, you may like to transfuse because bleeding risk is more. But nowadays, even arterial lines are placed using a SonoView. So if you have an expert guy, you might not even like to transfuse. And more important, the most important point, Dr. Ravi, which you have made is, don't look at INR for transfusion, look at TEG or ROTEM. Whichever dynamic criteria you use should be used for transfusing these patients, because they are usually not hypocoagulopathic. Somebody who has managed a transplant patient, an anesthesia guy who's managing a transplant for an ALF, will tell you that during transplant, these guys are hypercoagulable, many of these. In fact, so their blood will clot during this thing, despite INR, which is not recordable. So this is something which we would avoid doing in these patients for obvious reasons. Dr. Pathik, when would you ventilate? Would you ventilate all acute liver failures? Grade 2 to 3, grade 3 to 4, grade 4?
Grade, anything beyond grade 2. So difficult to manage, patient becomes irritable, violent, or means grade 3 is definite indication, but even grade 2, which becomes difficult to manage in the ward, is fighting, not allowing treatment, pulling out the lines, then we electively intubate and put them on ventilator.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you ask me any acute liver failure which has a bad prognostic criteria should be ventilated, because you can titrate your medication better. If the patient is becoming violent, it increases the ICT of these patients, the mortality is higher. So grade 3 and 4 are definite indications, but bad grade 2s also most of us would like to intubate. Anybody has a different comment on that? Dr. Srinivas, would you agree with that, or would you?
Fully agree.
Fully agree. Okay, so we move forward.
Manav, just a point, if I
yeah, Sharad, please, all yours.
Very quickly, I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. I think this is not published, but infections in ventilated patients in our ICU settings is a real problem. So with grade 2s, I tend to persist and see if I can manage them without ventilation. I think grade 3 is a no-brainer, we have to ventilate, but my threshold for ventilation has increased lately.
Okay, so I would in principle agree with you. Infections are higher, but in acute liver failure, it's a question of 2 or 3 days. Either you're going to lose that guy, or that guy is going to improve, or you're going to transplant him. So generally, a ventilator required infection would set in 3, 4, 5, 6 days later. So I would slightly change my criteria for an ALF as compared to any other ventilation, but in principle, I completely agree. Managing infection in a ventilated patient is a very difficult problem, and you want to avoid it as much as you can. So grade 3, 4 definitely needs ventilation. Grade 2, difficult grade 2, we might like to ventilate. Grade 1, nobody would like to ventilate these patients. Okay, let's move on to the last part of this thing, autoimmune hepatitis. Now, this is a peculiar problem. What I've done is, I have retained the same case. I've just changed that male to female, and I've increased the jaundice encephalopathy to 16 days to suit the system. So 25-year-old female, same history, jaundice encephalopathy 16 days, same presentation, 120 heart rate, liver span 2 spaces, grade 2 encephalopathy, same parameters, except that all viral biomarkers are negative here. The weight of the lady is 70 kg, mean arterial 65 and same values, lactate of 3.4. So who will answer that? I have to, anybody. What is the likelihood that this lady has autoimmune hepatitis with this background?
Just go
difficult to
back.
quantify. We don't have data. We don't know. So it's a bad question. It's an unfair question. Ravi, you want to say something?
Yeah, so with those enzymes, I would say unlikely, but if the enzymes were in a few hundreds, I would say probably yes.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Generally, in autoimmune hepatitis, you don't see enzymes in the range of 1,000. But again, clinical parameters may not be a good criteria to identify. You need more markers. There is one broad difference in the definition of ALF when you're talking about autoimmune versus all other acute liver failure, and that is even with presence of cirrhosis, if the patient fits into the clinical phenotype of ALF, which is jaundice, encephalopathy, and coagulopathy, you still call it acute liver failure. Even if the patient is a known cirrhotic, you call it acute liver failure. That brings us to the concept of fulminant autoimmune hepatitis. Fulminant autoimmune hepatitis is I would say is a diverse disease. You may have a chronic autoimmune hepatitis with a spontaneous exacerbation landing into autoimmune hepatitis. You may have a patient who had normal LFTs 1 year back and develops acute fulminant autoimmune hepatitis, which is just like acute liver failure. And you may have autoimmune cirrhosis with superimposed acute injury. That also would qualify as an autoimmune acute liver failure. Now, if you have such a myriad of cases leading to a same clinical phenotype, it is very difficult to arrive on a common treatment algorithm here. This is what I wanted to highlight by putting this point here. Okay, I have to ask Dr. Shalimar here. Okay, I'll just go over this straight away. The simplified diagnostic scoring system which you use for autoimmune hepatitis has been validated very well for chronic autoimmune hepatitis, but when you're talking about fulminant autoimmune, it does not work. Why? I'll talk about that. So you have to use the classical autoimmune scoring system to diagnose acute autoimmune hepatitis because your IgG levels are normal in almost 1/3 of patients of fulminant autoimmune hepatitis. Most of these patients have either very low autoantibody titers or they may be negative in at least 30 to 40% of patients. It is only histology which would give you a diagnosis in majority of these patients. So let me ask Dr. Shalimar here. Dr. Shalimar, if you see a patient of acute liver failure, a lady which you suspect may be having autoimmune hepatitis, would you go ahead and do a biopsy or would you look at some other parameters?
I think what you highlighted is the problem with the serological markers, even IgG. So we do not have a definitive, we cannot make a diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis unless we have a biopsy. So, and doing a biopsy in a sick patient, we all know the problems associated with it. So shifting, looking at worsening of his, you're giving unnecessary stimulus. And and plus the issues, if you get an autoimmune, does giving steroids, how much does it improve? It also increases the risk of infections. So I think I would not start steroids unless I have a definitive histological diagnosis, because data would suggest that steroids will increase risk of infections in such patients if given. So I would be a little skeptical and if possible, do a biopsy. If possible, transjugular biopsy can be done. Okay. That would really help, because a subset of patients can be managed with steroids, but with infections as a major issue associated with steroids.
So completely agree on that. That is why we want to devise a strategy in autoimmune. Yeah, Ravi, please.
So we'll have to wrap up. We're just finishing our time, and there are 4 questions also in the chat box.
So I'll take 1 more minute. I'll just give a strategy when you see a suspected autoimmune hepatitis associated fulminant hepatic failure, what you should do. I'll skip the data part. I'll just straight away go to the concept that if you are actually treating an autoimmune fulminant hepatitis, the results of steroids are very poor. There is a subset of patients who would improve with steroids, and how to identify that subset. I'll just straight away go to the last management plan, the last slide here. So you suspect autoimmune hepatitis, you diagnose only by biopsy. You cannot afford to start steroids in a fulminant hepatitis patient thinking that this patient may have autoimmune hepatitis. So first you think whether you can do a biopsy in this patient or not. Obviously it has to be a transjugular biopsy. It will cause further stimulation. You'll have to shift the patient to a cath lab or a fluoro facility, and you have to take a call on that. Which autoimmune hepatitis associated fulminants would respond to steroids? Somebody who has a MELD less than 26. So I'm not giving you the data here because we have limited time, but anybody who has a high MELD, I would say more than 25. The literature available, whatever limited literature is available, says that steroids do not help. 90% of these patients will die without a transplant. You may save one. But on the other hand, if you have a MELDer, obviously ALF will have a MELD more than 50. It is but obvious. So somebody who has a MELD between 15 and 25, and you suspect autoimmune, please go ahead, do a biopsy and try with steroids. The important thing again to realize here is, at 1 week, you can decide whether this patient is responding or not, and maybe earlier also. If the patient has a good response, you continue, otherwise you go for a transplant. If you continue giving steroids for long enough in these patients, and mind you, even with autoimmune hepatitis, these guys may linger on for maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and they are not responding, you are actually doing them a disfavor. You are increasing the risk of infections post-transplant also in these patients. So that's what I would propose, and over to chairperson. Ravi, you are mute.
Yeah, thank you, Manav, very much. It was a very interesting discussion, actually. So I'll start off with the first question, and I'll then request Dr. Shalimar to take up the second question. There are a few questions that have already been answered. One of them from Sagar, role of NAC infusion in ALF in our setting, which has been answered. The second one is about the dose of NAC. So it was, the question is it 150 milligram per kg per day, or as in paracetamol poisoning? So
you want me to take that question, or would you like to answer?
No,
you can tell your experience, sir. You can just say what you use.
No, please. I don't know the dose that we use. Sorry.
So we use at 150 milligram per kg per day as a continuous infusion. That generally comes to 8 to 9 grams per day infusion. We don't use a paracetamol recommended dose.
That was about NAC, and then there was one question about lactulose, which is already answered, about lactulose edema. Now one of the questions is, what is the role of plasma exchange in these patients?
So plasma exchange in acute liver failure. Now I will only say we don't use it. There is some data. If you don't have a transplant option, you can use. So there's a paper available in acute liver failure, the North American Consortium paper, which did talk about use of plasma exchange in patients. And it showed that somebody who does not have a transplant option, a proportion of them may improve with plasma exchange. But I have my doubts. We have not seen very good results. We don't use it. Shalimar, any experience with plasma exchange in ALF?
I think same here. The results have not been encouraging that much, but we've got a recent paper from the ILBS group showing it to be beneficial. Though sample size was 20 in both the arms, so showing it to be of statistical benefit in terms of improving the outcomes.
Yeah. So even our own experience has not been very good.
Yeah.
We need more data. So that has to be
very good. Yeah, it's more validation.
Dr. Shalimar, over to you for the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ravi. So, Dr. Mana, we've got a question is, what would be your choice of antibiotics, especially in a patient who's on CRRT or SLED and has ALF?
So, Shalimar, I've been trained at All India Institute just like you. So my choice of antibiotics is a broad spectrum cover, which includes a beta-lactamase, a gram-positive, and if the patient is on dialysis, I would add voriconazole also, because aspergillus is a major problem. That's what we use.
Definitely. The next, Dr. Sudhir raised the question, is CRRT recommended purely for hyperammonemia without renal failure or metabolic acidosis?
So, let's talk about what we do. It's not recommended as of now, but in our own experience, we have found it to be very useful. We would actually start CRRT in most patients of acute liver failure if they are hemodynamically stable and have very high ammonia. The cutoff we are using at our center is more than 200. Not just one value more than 200. Let's say the patient comes to emergency with a value more than 200, and 6 hours down the line after resuscitation, you still find it is 200. We would start them on CRRT, and what we have found is that it does improve the cerebral function. The edema part which you have does improve. It gives you more time to prepare for transplant. And many of these patients, if you can wait, if you can make them okay for long enough, would recover their liver function. So we are using CRRT in ALF patients as of now. But recommendation, no, it is not. Across centers, I don't know. Ravi has been using, Shalimar, you also have been using. Would you like to comment?
So we use it all. Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead and answer.
So we do it all the time, and our threshold is 150, more than 150 for 2 consecutive values or more, or single value of more than 200. And we have now more than 130 patients, ALF patients, that we have treated. One mortality related to cerebral edema. So, we are believers, although, like you said, there is not enough evidence or recommendation to that effect.
Yeah,
Shalimar,
would agree
your own
actually.
experience?
Yeah, would agree in terms of like, even there is a published data on CRRT showing benefit in terms of hyperammonemia and improving outcomes. Prospective studies are lacking. I think you guys all can group together and do real good studies. I think we are short of time, and can we close down out here? And I'll hand it. I'd like to thank Dr. Ravi for my co-chair, Dr. Manav, and all my panelists for an excellent discussion. And as usual, Manav, your case was exceptional. I think all the residents and the people who joined in would have definitely learned and would improve their outcome in terms of managing ALF patients. So with this, I'd like to close the session out here and hand it back over to the organizers. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, chairpersons, and the panel members, and the moderator.